This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture. And welcome to the City of God podcast, where we are weekly talking about today's biggest cultural issues, all through the lens of God's infallible word. My name is Rob Pacienza, and as always, joined by my co-host, John Rabe. John, great to see you today.
Great to see you as always, Rob. We've got an important discussion to have today about some things that are frankly troubling that are happening legally in our nation right now.
Absolutely. Today's guest is Senior Counsel of the Thomas More Society. He specializes in constitutional law and has worked on many civil liberty cases. Steve Crampton, great to have you on the program today.
Thank you all so much for having me. It's really good to be with you.
Steve, people might not know exactly some of the cases that you've been working on in particular recently, but everybody's been super familiar about the news story that broke several weeks ago concerning the 6 pro-lifers that were convicted in Tennessee. Tell our audience a little bit about that case and your involvement in it.
Sure. The case arose in Mount Juliet, Tennessee, a town outside of Nashville, and involved a Carafum abortion clinic located on the second floor of a multi-tenant medical facility. So back in March of 2021, almost 3 years ago to the day, it was 3 years ago last week, peaceful group of pro-lifers went into the building, where, of course, they were allowed because it's open to the public generally, and didn't attempt to go into the clinic, but some of them did locate in front of the entrances to the clinic. They prayed, they sang hymns, they reached out to abortion-minded women. Of course, the police were called. In fact, a pretty large contingent of police showed up. They'd never seen a protest of this nature before. So Paul Vaugh, my client, ended up reaching out to the police, being concerned that they didn't seem to know what they were doing, and it ended up becoming sort of the go-between between the pro-lifers at one end of the hall where the clinic was located and the police who were at the other end of the hall. The event lasted about 2.5 hours, after which the police got virtually everybody to leave but about a dozen folks who were peacefully arrested, charged with criminal trespass, and everybody went home. Paul Vaugh was not one of the ones that was arrested. He goes home. The event is over. And over a year and a half later, October of 2022, Paul is arrested at gunpoint at his home outside Centerville, Tennessee, by 4 armed FBI agents in full SWAT gear, totally taken by surprise. Hauled down to the prison or the facility in Nashville. No ID, no cell phone, nothing. After 6 hours of processing, they just dumped him out in the streets downtown Nashville. His wife, nobody knew where he was. He had a business meeting he was supposed to be at that day. Missed that, obviously, and they were a bit upset, but what's he going to do? Anyway, he's charged, as are the other 6, with violation of the Federal Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, the FACE Act as it's known. And in addition, that, by the way, is a 6-month misdemeanor, maximum 6-month penalty. And then, though, they threw in, for the first time, in my view, in our constitutional history, a federal felony conspiracy charge, conspiracy against rights, under which he faces up to 10 years in prison. So that's the background. We went to trial in January. I guess we can talk about that momentarily if you like. But
yeah, well, we will. I want to ask you more about that, but it's astounding to me to hear this story because, supposedly we cannot still today figure out who it was who brought a bag of cocaine into the West Wing of the White House, the most secure place in the country. Don't know who brought that in. We don't know. We still don't know who leaked the Dobbs decision as the Supreme Court was working on that. You've got a handful of people who work for the Supreme Court. Can't figure out who could possibly have leaked that decision. And yet this man is tracked down, who wasn't even arrested at the time, tracked down well after the fact and arrested. It seems to me that there's extra, and you've laid out the situation. It seems to me, Steve, that there is an extra oomph behind this prosecution that we have not typically seen. Where is that coming from? What's driving that?
Here's the all-important development between March 2021 and October 2022. June 24, 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court announces the decision in Dobbs against Jackson Women's Health Organization, overturning Roe v. Wade, and the entire pro-abortion apple cart is upset. So at that point, the Biden administration doubles down, basically declares war on pro-lifers. So they start going back in history to find these little local peaceful protests and singling out pro-lifers like Paul Vaugh for the most vicious, aggressive prosecution they can put together in order to send the message that we are totally pro-abortion. Don't you dare, pro-life Christians, mess with the abortion clinics anymore. I think that's exactly what we've seen here.
So, Steve, talk to us about your involvement and the Thomas More Society's involvement as well with this most recent case.
Yeah, well, let me just preface it with other attorneys at the Thomas More Society and myself. We've been involved in FACE cases for decades. Frankly, I challenged FACE back in 1994, shortly after it was enacted. We've handled FACE cases throughout. We've, by God's grace, been fairly successful in several of them. And so in this particular case, I was lead counsel for Paul Vaugh. We actually had worked with several of the other co-defendants before, but under criminal laws of ethics, you generally can't represent more than one client. So we were trial counsel for Paul in this most recent case.
Wow.
So with this case, with the decision, what are the next steps? What do you see coming for your client? What do you expect the next year or two to hold?
May I say before we get there too, gentlemen, that one of the things that was particularly, I think, disheartening, at least for me, in this go-round, we tried the case in Nashville, Tennessee, right? That's a red state where, as a matter of fact, today, abortion itself is the felony, not blocking access to a clinic. The clinic at which this event occurred has gone out of business because they can't provide surgical abortions any longer. So you've got this preposterous situation where when the charges were filed, abortion was a felony in the very state where the event occurred, okay? So also the opportunity in this case to try the case in basically, the heartland, as people talk about Tennessee being everybody's got a belt buckle, I guess, of the Bible Belt these days. But I mean, Tennessee's a conservative place.
Sure.
I felt like we actually had, in a rare confluence of events, something close to a jury of our peers. And Paul Vaugh in particular, who never blocked a door, didn't interfere with anybody, didn't intimidate anyone, ought to have been found not guilty, shouldn't have been charged in the first place, in our view. And yet, even among the Heartland's kind of people, they didn't really seem to have any hesitation in finding Paul and the others guilty. Paul, apparently, they found, aided and abetted the others who were at the door. The government's theory was Paul was speaking to the police, yes, but his intent was really this underhanded, nefarious. He was trying to delay them from making the inevitable arrests of the others, and therefore he was conspiring with them and so forth. That was the government's theory. It looks preposterous to me on its face, but apparently they made their case adequately to the jury. So where we are is we're waiting a pre-sentencing report where they go through the sentencing guidelines and determine what the baseline recommended sentence ought to be under all these other factors of what his past has been and whether there were real victims here and so on. Anyway, and then we go to the sentencing hearing on July the 2nd. And only then can we file our appeal. And of course, we will appeal. We believe FACE is unconstitutional. We think it was unconstitutional when it was filed. And even more so now that its only real reason for existence from the get-go was the so-called federal right to abortion. Well, guess what? There is no federal right to abortion. Never really was. But now the Supreme Court has made that very clear. So what are we doing with the feds interfering in a purely local crime to begin with? I mean, this is the quintessence of peaceful protest. This is First Amendment activity with just a little fringe of illegality only because the feds had artificially created this FACE Act to begin with. So we think we have strong arguments. We have acts in Congress now that in both houses that call for the repeal of FACE. But politically, of course, it's a tough sell. We don't expect that's really going to succeed. But the fact is, this is an outrage, and every American ought to be outraged. This idea of conspiracy, by the way, could easily encompass any sit-in that's ever taken place. Take us back to the civil rights movement in the 60s. Nashville, in fact, was a part of civil rights activity. All around the federal courthouse are monuments to the heroes of the civil rights movement. Guess what? They engaged in precisely the activity that the folks that were sitting in front of the door did here. They're heroes. Our folks are now martyrs being sentenced to the federal penitentiary. Something's wrong in America.
No doubt. And we're grateful for the Thomas More Society. We certainly featured the attorneys doing great work through Thomas More Society on our television program, Truths to Transform. And thankful for you, Steve, defending our citizens and protecting their constitutional rights. Something you mentioned previously, what in the world are the feds doing? Disrupting and arresting and prosecuting people who are simply living out their constitutional liberties and freedoms. And that really leads us to another discussion of the overarching, unprecedented weaponization of the Department of Justice here in America. And I know people hear that, maybe even people in our audience, and they hear it as an overreaction. But when you hear me say that we are seeing unprecedented weaponization of the Justice Department here in America, give us your feedback and your thoughts on that comment.
I mean, I really appreciate that. And you're so right about, there's so much hyperbole on both sides of the political aisle these days. A large segment of America, first of all, a large segment is not even listening. But those that do tune in and try to follow the arguments are so accustomed to hearing extremist language, shall we say. They build up a bit of an immunity to the reality, in this case, as you laid out there, of how bad things really are. And I think the weaponization is by no means an overstatement in this case. Paul Vaugh and these other faithful pro-life believers are not the only victims. We look at the January 6th prosecutions, and most, I think, Americans see what those folks did on that day. Yes, were there some excesses? Yes. Have there been excesses in a BLM riot? Oh, I think so. Antifa stuff? What was the Wall Street stuff, where they shut them down? I can't remember.
Occupy Wall Street.
Occupy Wall Street, all of that stuff, right? A lot of buildings burned in those things. Never did they dream of bringing felony conspiracy against rights charges in those instances. Most of those folks were not even prosecuted.
Of course not.
So you line up the things like the January 6th prosecutions, the prosecutions against the pro-lifers like Paul Vaugh in Tennessee. By the way, we also defended a case in Washington, D.C. back in the fall, almost identical charges, the felony conspiracy charges. And we have another one in Michigan next month. So there's a series of these where they just prosecute, single out pro-lifers for prosecution. You look at the prosecution of President Trump. Most of the world knows this is a joke, right? Nothing but political persecution. And then, for me, the most startling thing in this FACE Act context alone, you may recall when they go to shepherd the FACE Act through Congress. By the way, it was Teddy Kennedy who led the charge in the Senate. They had to reach out to their folks across the aisle in order to get enough votes to pass it. That often happens, right? That's the way the system is intended to operate. One of the bones they threw the Republicans was another provision in the FACE Act that protects pro-life pregnancy resource centers and churches. Well, guess what's happened since Dobbs? Hundreds of attacks against churches, fire bombings of pregnancy resource centers, including in Nashville, Tennessee, by the way. Guess how many prosecutions? Maybe 4 grand total. And here's their comeback. Y'all talk about how did they find Paul Vaugh. Unfortunately, some of our folks live streamed the event when they were inside that medical facility. So it wasn't very hard to find them. But that also suggests they didn't think they were doing much wrong, doesn't it? And what does Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, say about why they don't prosecute these folks that are firebombing pregnancy resource centers? Well, shucks, that stuff happens in the nighttime. How are we supposed to find them? Do you think they're even looking for these guys? So the very act under which they're prosecuting Paul Vaugh and others like him also protects these pregnancy resource centers and churches, but the government is doing nothing. There are no task forces formed up to investigate the church bombings and all. They have a reproductive rights task force, though, and they have the Civil Rights Division totally sold out to the abortion lobby in order to protect the right to abortion at all costs. This is not fair and equal application of the law. This is not equal justice under the law. This is weaponization.
Yeah, and you know, when you look at what's going on there, the less than a handful of prosecutions for those who have firebombed and attacked pro-life pregnancy centers and churches, it's just right on the front of it, evidence that these crimes are not being investigated, that there's not an effort being made, where again, we're pouring through reams and reams of tape of all these pro-life protests and so forth. Peaceful protests, I might add. Peaceful people being taken to jail while people who are firebombing are not even sought. But clarify for me, if you would, does the FACE Act apply to protecting those pregnancy centers and so forth? If I understood you correctly, it does. But how does the FACE Act apply to churches and pro-life pregnancy centers? Though it's practically irrelevant since clearly no one's enforcing it.
Yeah. Hey, look, that's a fair question. Here's what they did. They said they defined not in terms of abortion services. What they did, again, euphemistically, right? They're masters of language on the other side. So instead of calling it access to abortion, which is what it was originally called, by the way, in the early drafts, they call it access to reproductive health services, right? Reproductive health services is broadly defined to include even pro-life counseling. They don't call it that, but any counseling regarding reproductive health, right? Well, when our people are doing sidewalk counseling or in the pregnancy resource centers, they're genuinely counseling and offering ultrasounds and alternatives and so forth. There's no question those are reproductive rights and reproductive health services. So one provision protects the counseling and offering of reproductive health services, and the other provision protects the facilities in which those things occur. So a bombing of a pregnancy resource center is squarely within the confines of the FACE Act. In addition, it includes the specific terminology, houses of worship. So churches are, again, kind of like an add-on here to the language of FACE, just to buy the votes of the Republicans. They never intended to enforce it. It has virtually never been enforced in its 30-plus years of its existence against churches. But reluctantly, when we're pressing them, sometimes they will enforce it there.
If somebody was to say, and I've heard this actually said by many well-meaning Bible-believing Christians, well, who cares if they strip away our civil liberties? Who cares if our freedoms are taken away? As long as we have Jesus and we know where we're going, that's really all that matters at the end of the day. What is your call to action and your reminder to the people of God and to any citizen that loves principled freedom here in America of why it is right and appropriate to fight and defend, to hold on to the civil liberties that our founders fought for and desired to enshrine in the Constitution?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that's really kind of the heart of it for us, isn't it? And let me say, in the same context, there are other pro-life activists who would say, oh, those guys that block doors, we don't really have anything to do with them anyway. It's not a big deal if they go to jail. But here's the rub of it, in my view. Having practiced in this area for over 30 years and seen these things up close and personal, at the heart of the matter, the reason they don't like folks outside abortion clinics in the first place is not because they sometimes sit in front of a door. It's because of what they say. What's the heart of the gospel but sharing your faith, asking hard questions, telling hard truths to folks that really probably don't want to hear it in most cases, right? I personally found it very offensive when folks would talk to me about the gospel when I was a lost goose out there, right?
Yeah.
The heart of all of this backlash against the pro-life movement is not the actions, it's the speech. It's the essence of the gospel. And what the First Amendment is intended to protect in a global sort of sense is that ultimate right to confront folks in the public ways with ideas that are maybe foreign to them, maybe they find a downright hostile. So at the end of the day, it's not just the right to protest outside an abortion clinic that's at risk here. It's the very right to share the gospel, period. Have we not seen the erosion of the First Amendment across the board lately? In the schools, it's harassment if you tell somebody there's only two genders kind of thing, only two sexes, right? It's harassment if you dare say to somebody, what you're doing is not right in the eyes of the Lord. I mean, we don't like hearing hostile speech that messes with our worldview and our actions ultimately. So for those that say we're Christians and we're ready to go, two things. One, what does it mean to love your neighbor? And as Christ challenged in Luke 15, who's your neighbor, right? All of these folks. You going to stand idly by while these babies are sent to be slaughtered to the tune of 65 million? And by the way, today, of course, we have the additional challenge of chemical abortions. We don't even get to meet them in the public. How do you even find these people, right? How dare we sit idly by when our neighbors are being slaughtered before our eyes? And second, if you care about the gospel, the right to free speech is at risk. The entire First Amendment is at risk today with this kind of weaponization and two-tiered justice system.
And if anyone doubts that, if anyone doubts the two tiers and the viewpoint discrimination that's taking place here, it's just very simple. Turn on the news, ask yourself, look at pro-Hamas demonstrations, closing down highways, closing down buildings, closing down events, sometimes erupting in violence. Look at the Black Lives Matter and associated organizations were shutting down police stations and neighborhoods in 2020 on Antifa and so forth, and then ask yourself the question: how many of those people that are involved in these sorts of protests have gone to federal prison? How many have received long sentences? You'll find that it's virtually nil, and with many times the number of participants than what we've had at the pro-life demonstrations and so forth. So the viewpoint discrimination, I think, is really clear. So are you seeing other cases come up like this, Steve? What other sorts of things are you at the Thomas More Society working on? What should we be keeping an eye on as we look to the future of these sorts of cases?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the transgender movement, I guess we can call it, to me presents as great a threat as anything we've seen today, too. I mean, not only are you mutilating young children who have no idea what the future holds for them after undergoing these irrevocable processes, but you're also, again, deconstructing fundamental truths that any 5-year-old can attest to, right? You're either a man or a woman, a boy or a girl. You probably heard about the case recently, this is not our case, but where the woman is suing the vet who wouldn't treat her son who thinks he's a cat, right? I mean, you've just got to be kidding me. So at the end of the day, the attack, and it fascinates me, y'all, I hope can appreciate this from the City of God kind of perspective. Ultimately, all of these attacks, the one unifying factor in my view is they are attacking the fundamental truths of God himself, right? Yep. They won't say directly, it's God that we hate, but their actions kind of belie their words that way. I mean, when God says male and female, I created them, right? I mean, how simple and clear is that? And so we, in our hubris, want to undertake the deconstruction of everything that any pagan society has taken for granted, right? That knows without really thinking about it. And so what I guess I would say is, Thomas More in the pro-life protections are, of course, at the heart of what we do. But we find ourselves in these family situations. You know, marriage has already kind of taken the big hit. We hope one day to see that restored. But now the fundamental rights of parents, the rights of even children, the UN rights of the child kind of thing. What an irony. What that wants to present is the right to do these things to yourself when you don't even know what you're doing. I mean, it is so gruesome what we're doing to ourselves as a society without any recognition for the long-term effects and inevitable consequences of these things. So, those kinds of issues we find are more and more to the forefront and just must be confronted. when our schools won't even let you talk about the truth of the matter without mentioning God, right? What have we become in America? It's kind of like my military friends say, we're living in a target-rich environment, and you're practicing First Amendment law and protecting religious freedoms.
I think this conversation today is a great reminder for our audience that elections have consequences. Right. Elections have consequences at the federal level, at the state level, and the local level. And I pray, this was such a fascinating conversation. And Steve, we've got to have you back on. Again, I just hope it's another reminder for our audience to be engaged in the public square, that God has called us personally, but he has not called us to a private faith, but to a public faith. And we're grateful for Christians like you who are applying their faith to the sphere of law and to the sphere of the public square. So thank you for being a defender of our rights. It was Augustine who said it best. If you want to know a little bit about a country or a nation, find out what they love the most. And it's no doubt for 250 years, Americans have loved liberty and freedom. But without God and a common morality, and for individuals like yourself that are defending those liberties, we really have no hope for the future. So keep on keeping on, and thank you so much for joining us today.
God bless you all. It's really been a pleasure. Enjoyed our conversation. Went entirely too fast.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate you, brother.
And thank you once again for joining us on the City of God podcast. If you were encouraged by today's conversation with Steve Crampton from the Thomas More Society, we pray that you would pass this episode along to a family member or a friend or anyone who wants to explore the intersection of faith and culture in the 21st century. Thank you once again for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the City of God. The City of God podcast is produced by Coral Ridge Ministries and made in partnership with the Institute for Faith and Culture. Visit us at cityofgodpodcast.com to access all of our previous episodes. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or anywhere you get podcasts. A full video version of this podcast is available on YouTube. This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture.